His hands shook as he knocked, barely old enough to stand but already cast aside. "My father said I don't deserve love," he whispered. The elder couple opened the door and found their purpose. The knock came just before dawn, soft and uncertain. Walter Greaves almost didn't hear it above the wind. But it came again, a little louder this time, like the trembling hand behind it had mustered every ounce of courage it had left. He was already at the table, nursing a mug of lukewarm tea, when the sound pulled his gaze toward the door. His bones ached from another night of restless sleep, and though his wife, Miriam, still dozed gently in the back room, he rose without a word, as he always did. When he opened the door, he expected a stray dog, maybe a lost traveler. But instead, standing on the frost-covered step was a boy. Thin, rail-thin. His coat hung off him like it belonged to a man twice his size, sleeves dragging past tiny fingers. His face was dirt-streaked, one eye swollen, lip cracked. But it was the look in his eyes that froze Walter, eyes too old for a child, too hollow. He clutched a rolled-up sack beneath one arm like it carried all he owned in the world. The cold bit at his bare ankles where torn trousers had ridden up. And when he spoke, his voice was little more than gravel wrapped in fear. "Please, I won't stay. I just need to sit, just till the sun comes up." Walter didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. He stepped aside, holding the door open wide. The boy hesitated like he couldn't quite believe it. Then he stepped in. The heat from the hearth hit him like a wave. He flinched, as if warmth was something that had to be earned. He stayed just inside the door, not moving further, until Walter nodded toward the chair beside the fire. "Sit, you'll freeze standing there." The boy obeyed, curling into the seat like a stray pup too tired to run anymore. Walter fetched a thick wool blanket and draped it across the child's shoulders. Still, he didn't speak. Not until the steam from the tea curled up beneath his nose and Walter placed the mug into his shaking hands. "Name?" Walter asked gently. The boy didn't answer at first. Then he blinked up through lashes crusted with sleep and whispered, "Dawson." "Last name?" The boy hesitated. "Just Dawson, that's what he called me." Walter didn't ask who he was. He didn't have to. Miriam emerged from the back then, her gray braid falling over one shoulder, eyes still cloudy from sleep. She took one look at the boy by the fire and said nothing at all, just walked over and placed a hand gently on his head. It was the kind of touch that said, "You're safe here," even if the words never came. And Dawson, little broken Dawson, broke. He didn't sob. He didn't cry. But his shoulders shook under the blanket, and the tea in his hands rippled as if a storm had started inside him. He didn't speak until Miriam knelt before him, her hands cradling his like a mother might. "My father said I don't deserve love," Dawson whispered. "Said I was born wrong, that even God must have turned his face." Miriam's breath hitched, but she didn't flinch. She only whispered back, "Your father was wrong." Walter didn't move. His fists clenched at his sides, rage trying to creep into the warmth of the room, but he kept his voice even. "How long you been out there?" 2 days. Dawson looked toward the window. "Walked from Hollow Ridge. Slept under a cart the first night. Last night I tried a barn, but they chased me off with a cane." Walter and Miriam exchanged a glance. Hollow Ridge was 20 miles north, more if you count the switchback trails. "You walked that far?" The boy nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. "He said if I came back he'd bury me beside Mama, said that's where I belonged now." Miriam stood, walking briskly into the kitchen. She began cracking eggs and slicing the heel of bread from the last loaf. Walter sat beside the boy and leaned forward. "You ever shoot a rifle, Dawson?" The boy shook his head. "Good," Walter said. "Means you ain't started hardening yet." Miriam returned with a plate, setting it down without a word. Eggs, toast, and a spoonful of jam. Dawson stared at it like it might disappear if he blinked. Then slowly he began to eat. Every bite was cautious, as though expecting someone to slap it from his hand. They let him eat. They didn't ask more questions. The boy didn't need interrogation. He needed rest. After breakfast, Miriam led Dawson to the small loft above the kitchen. It wasn't much, just a cot, a quilt, and a view of the hills beyond the pasture. But when Dawson saw it, he blinked rapidly. This for me." Miriam nodded. "You can stay as long as you need." Dawson didn't move for a moment. Then he walked over and laid his small sack beside the cot. He sat carefully, testing the weight of the mattress as if unsure it was real. Then he lay down, curled into himself, and within moments sleep claimed him. Downstairs, Walter stoked the fire while Miriam busied herself clearing the plates. Neither spoke until the dishes were done and the cabin had gone still. "Walter," Miriam said quietly, "he can't go back." "He won't," Walter replied. They didn't have children. Years ago they'd tried, prayed, waited, buried hope in the soil like seeds that never took, and eventually they stopped asking. But something about the boy's voice, his trembling hands, the weight he carried in his eyes, had unearthed every dormant instinct. Walter stepped outside, needing air. The morning was cold but bright, the snow crusted hard over the field. He walked to the fence line, eyes scanning the horizon. A hawk circled high above, wind tugging at its wings. He didn't hear the horse until it was too close. A rider came slow from the north, dusty, long coat flapping, hat low over his eyes. The man pulled his horse to a stop just past the gate, and Walter's gut tightened. "Morning," the stranger said, voice dry as rust. "Morning," Walter returned. "I'm looking for a boy, 'bout so high." He held his hand to chest level, "ran off Tuesday." Walter didn't blink. "You a lawman?" The man smirked. "You see a badge?" "Then you ain't got reason to be here." The man's eyes hardened. "Name's Crowder, Boyd Crowder, the boy's mine." Walter's jaw clenched. "He say that?" "Don't need to, blood don't lie." Walter took a step closer to the gate. "Boy showed up here near dead. You want him, you'll have to answer to me." Crowder's lips curled. "You threatening me, old man?" "I'm telling you, ride on. Ain't nothing for you here." Crowder's hand twitched near his belt, not quite a reach but close. Then he spat into the snow and tugged the reins. "This ain't done." As he rode off, Walter didn't move, just watched until the figure disappeared over the ridge. Back inside, Miriam was waiting. "He was watching from the loft," she said softly. "He heard everything." Walter looked up toward the ceiling. "Good." That night Dawson didn't eat much. He sat quiet at the table, eyes shadowed. When Miriam reached for his hand, he let her hold it. "Do I have to leave?" he asked softly. Walter shook his head. "You're home now." But none of them knew what would come next. Crowder wasn't a man to walk away. And Hollow Ridge had a way of clinging to its own, even the ones it threw away. The cold wind shrieked louder the next morning, and frost feathered the edges of the cabin windows. Miriam lit the stove before the sun had fully risen, her hands moving by memory. She kept glancing toward the loft. She didn't want to wake Dawson, but she couldn't stop worrying either, not after yesterday. His words still echoed in the corners of her mind. "My father said I don't deserve love." No child should ever say that. No child should ever believe it. Walter came in from the barn dusted with straw, carrying 2 buckets of water and a stern quiet that clung to him like the cold. He set the buckets down, nodded once at Miriam, then took his usual place at the table. When she poured his coffee, his hand brushed hers, just enough to say, "I'm thinking the same thing." Dawson didn't come down until after the smell of eggs and cornbread filled the air. He moved slow, as if expecting scolding just for waking up. He paused halfway down the ladder, eyes scanning the room like a hunted creature. "Morning," Miriam said gently, not turning from the stove. Walter glanced up and gave a nod. "Coffee's hot if you want." Dawson blinked. Then he stepped down the rest of the way, quietly pulled out a chair and sat. Miriam placed a plate in front of him, nothing fancy, just enough. His eyes widened again, same as they had the day before. Gratitude, disbelief, fear, it all warred on his face. He didn't speak until half the plate was gone. "Why are you being nice to me?" he asked quietly, not looking up. Miriam paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Because it's the right thing to do." He frowned. "People don't usually do right by me." Walter leaned forward then, arms folded across the table. "That's their failure, not yours." Dawson stared into his plate, jaw tight, but he nodded. Later, Walter took him out to the shed. He showed him the tools, the feed sacks, the way to bundle kindling. Dawson didn't speak much, but he watched everything. When Walter handed him a small hatchet, the boy hesitated. "Won't hurt no one," Walter said, "just the logs." Dawson nodded slowly and took the hatchet with both hands. His first swing was weak, clumsy. Walter didn't laugh. He didn't correct him with harshness. Just knelt beside him and guided his hands. "There, let the weight do the work." An hour passed, then two. Walter split the big logs, Dawson split kindling. The rhythm settled something in the air between them. When they paused, Dawson glanced up and asked, "Were you ever a dad?" Walter didn't answer right away. He sank onto the stump and looked toward the hills. "No," he said eventually. "We tried, the Lord said no." Dawson looked down. "Then why take me in?" Walter met his gaze. "Because maybe the Lord said yes in a different way." Dawson didn't speak after that, but his next swing hit the log clean and true. Back in the cabin, Miriam watched them through the window. She hadn't seen Walter speak so much in years. Not since before they stopped planting the nursery crib. Not since they buried the tiny bundle under the cottonwood tree 30 years ago. Walter never talked about that day. Neither did she. Some griefs lived in silence. That evening, Dawson helped her shell beans and peel potatoes. He worked slow, deliberate, like he didn't want to ruin anything. Miriam hummed a church hymn as she stirred the stew. Dawson finally looked up and asked, "Do you miss church?" She paused, spoon hovering over the pot. "I still speak to God, even if I don't sit in a pew." Dawson tilted his head. "My daddy said God only listened to folks like him." Miriam turned then, crouched so they were eye to eye. "Dawson, I don't know what your father believed, but I know this. God listens to children who walk through snow alone just to survive. I think he listens closest to them." Dawson didn't cry, not then, but his eyes stayed wet through the rest of supper. That night after he'd gone to bed, Miriam and Walter sat at the table, both sipping coffee gone cold. "He's been beat," Walter said quietly. Miriam nodded. "Bruises too old for cold nights, too fresh for a fall." They were silent a while, fire crackling behind them. "We keep him," she said. Walter looked over, brows raised slightly. "You sure?" She nodded. "We keep him." It should have felt good, but unease wrapped tight around them both. Boyd Crowder had said this ain't done, and men like him didn't bluff. The next morning proved it. They found the message on their fence post. A strip of bloodied cloth, tied tight, stained deep. It wasn't fresh, but it had purpose, a warning, a reminder. Walter's jaw worked as he stared at it. He yanked it off and tossed it into the stove without a word. But Miriam saw the way his hand shook after. Crowder hadn't gone far. 3 days passed, then 5. During that time, Dawson began to thaw, slowly. He asked questions about the tools, the animals, the cabin. He helped feed the chickens and collect eggs. He read from an old Bible Walter kept by the mantel, sounding out verses with quiet reverence. He never asked for more than what was offered. He never took what wasn't his. One night, while washing dishes, he asked Miriam, "Do you think someone like me could ever be good?" She dried her hands, knelt beside him, and whispered, "You already are." Then came the 6th night. Walter was on the porch. Dawson sat inside playing with a carved wooden horse Miriam had unearthed from an old box in the attic. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. All seemed still. Until the silence broke. 3 riders came over the ridge. No rush, no panic, just slow, deliberate descent, like men who knew they were expected. Walter didn't call inside. He didn't move. He just watched them come. When they reached the edge of the property, the lead rider, Crowder, raised a hand. "Evening." Walter didn't reply. "We had us an agreement." "No, we didn't." Crowder smirked. "I let you keep him a week. That's more mercy than most get." "He's not going back." "You don't decide that." Walter stepped off the porch, hands empty but posture solid. "Boy says he ain't yours no more." Crowder's eyes darkened. "He's blood." "Blood don't make you a father." From inside, Dawson watched through the window. Miriam tried to pull him back, but he shook her off. "I need to see," he whispered. Outside, Crowder dismounted. The 2 men behind him stayed mounted, hands near their belts. The tension in the air was tight enough to snap. "You hiding behind old bones now, boy?" Crowder called toward the house. Walter stepped between him and the door. "You'll leave now." "I'll leave with the boy." "No." Crowder's lip curled. "Then I'll take him over your dead." A click stopped the sentence. Miriam stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, steady. "I won't miss," she said calmly, "and I've buried worse." Crowder stared at her a moment, fury simmering just behind his teeth. Then he spat into the dirt. "This ain't done." He turned, mounted, and rode off. The others followed. Dust kicked up behind them like smoke from a fire just starting to catch. Inside, Dawson collapsed into a chair. "He won't stop," he whispered. "He'll keep coming." Walter placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then we keep standing." But Miriam's gaze stayed on the ridge, her hands trembling now that the rifle was down. Because she knew something had shifted. Crowder wouldn't come again with words. The next time, he'd bring fire. The days that followed were quieter, but not peaceful. The kind of silence that settles before a storm, when even the birds don't sing and the air feels like it's holding its breath. Walter sharpened his tools in the early light, not because he needed them sharp, but because his hands had to stay busy. Miriam made jam out of the last of the winter apples, though her eyes lingered far too often on the windows, especially after dusk. Dawson moved through the cabin like someone who didn't want to make ripples. He did his chores without asking. He folded blankets no one told him to fold. He kept his voice low and his eyes scanning the woods outside. He wasn't hiding exactly, but he wasn't living either. On the 4th morning, the dog came limping back. Old Scout, half-deaf and nearly blind, hadn't been seen since Crowder's first visit. Walter figured he'd wandered too far and laid down in the woods for good. But now he was back, dragging his back leg, one eye swollen shut, patches of fur gone from his side. Dawson was the one who found him. He was hauling kindling to the porch when he saw the dog dragging itself across the pasture. The boy dropped the bundle and ran, falling to his knees beside the animal. "Scout," he whispered, voice shaking. "Hey, it's okay, you're okay." Walter heard the cry and came running. When he reached them, he knelt beside the boy and laid a hand on the dog's ribcage. Shallow breaths, shaky, still warm. "He's alive," Dawson said urgently. "We gotta help him." Walter didn't say what he was thinking, that the dog was too old, too broken to heal. Instead, he scooped the animal up gently and carried him inside. Miriam cleared the table in a rush, laying out towels and fetching warm water. Dawson hovered close, hands wringing in his coat. He wouldn't leave Scout's side, even when Walter warned him that it might not be enough. "I know what it feels like," Dawson said softly. "To be left for dead. He don't deserve that." "Neither did you," Walter wanted to say, but he kept that thought to himself. Scout didn't die, not that day. By nightfall, he was breathing steadier. Dawson slept beside him on the floor, one hand resting on the dog's shoulder. Miriam laid an extra quilt over them both before she blew out the lamp. The next morning, Walter saddled the mule. He needed to go to town. Supplies, nails, flour, salt, more than that, information. News traveled slow out in the hills, but Walter had a feeling Crowder hadn't gone far. He didn't tell Dawson he was leaving, just told Miriam quietly over coffee and kissed her cheek before heading out. Miriam watched him disappear down the trail, her hand resting lightly on the window frame. She knew Walter, knew that look in his eye. It was the same look he'd worn the day they buried their stillborn son, and the preacher had said it was God's plan. Walter never went back to that church. Never said a word against God either. Just started building fences that didn't need building and chopping wood that didn't need chopping. She'd never seen a man carry grief with such discipline. Back at the cabin, Dawson kept to himself. He fed Scout boiled oats with broth, sat beside him reading from the old Bible, pausing often to ask Miriam what the big words meant. She answered as best she could, surprised at how steady her voice stayed. That night, long after Dawson had gone to sleep and Scout lay snoring at the hearth, Miriam sat by the fire knitting. The click of her needles echoed in the stillness. She didn't realize she dozed off until a sound snapped her awake. Not a knock, not a howl. A whisper. Someone moving outside. She rose slowly, heart thudding, crossed to the door and pressed her ear against it. The snow outside hadn't fallen in days, so the crunch of boots was unmistakable. Miriam didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rifle. She opened the door fast, too fast. Her eyes locked on a figure stumbling through the shadows. Walter. He was bleeding. She rushed forward, catching him under one arm. Walter, what happened? He shook his head, lips pale. Ambushed on the road. Crowder. He nodded. Didn't kill me. Wanted me to crawl back and send a message. Miriam helped him inside, eased him into a chair. Dawson, woken by the commotion, rushed into the room. His face went pale when he saw Walter. I'll get water, he said. Miriam pressed cloth to Walter's side. You're lucky it missed anything deep. Walter grunted, didn't miss by much. Dawson returned with water and clean cloths. Miriam worked fast, her hands trembling only once. They said 3 days, Walter whispered. Then they're coming, not just Crowder, a few others. Said they'll burn the place if we don't hand him over. Dawson's shoulders stiffened. Then I'll go. No, Walter said, stronger now. You're not leaving. You're hurt. You shouldn't have to bleed because of me. Walter grabbed the boy's wrist. This isn't because of you. It's because men like him think they can take what they want. That ends here. They reinforced the doors that night, boarded the windows, laid out tools and old hunting gear. It wasn't much of a defense, but it was something. Miriam filled every lantern. Dawson fetched stones for the fire pit. They didn't speak much. The next morning, Scout stood on all fours for the first time in days. His back leg still dragged, but he barked once, a deep, hoarse sound that felt like a promise. Dawson smiled for the first time since Walter returned. You're still fighting, huh? Scout wagged his tail weakly. By midday, a new tension had settled over the cabin. 3 days. They had 3 days. Walter taught Dawson how to load the rifle, how to brace the butt against his shoulder. He didn't want to, but if things went wrong, he wanted the boy to have a chance. Miriam kept the stove running, baking bread and warming stews. She moved like someone preparing for a long winter, quiet, focused. That night they all slept in the main room, Scout included. No one wanted to be alone. Dawson lay awake longest. He watched the fire fade, the shadows stretch, and when he closed his eyes, he remembered his mother. He remembered the lullabies, the warmth, the way she whispered that he was loved always, even when she grew sick, even when the light left her eyes. He remembered the way his father looked at her grave, like it was her fault, like Dawson had taken something she owned. "You killed her," his father had said once, "and I've been cursed ever since." That was the first time he'd been whipped. It wasn't the last. Dawson opened his eyes again and looked at the ceiling beams. "I don't want to be afraid forever," he whispered. In the darkness, Scout stirred. The dog crawled closer, resting his head against Dawson's side. The next day came clear and cold. The second of the three. Walter's wound had stiffened, but he moved stubbornly around the property, checking the fences and the trails. Miriam tried to get him to rest, but he shook her off. "They're coming. I need to be ready." Dawson followed him most of the day, not asking questions, just learning. They planted nails in boards and hid them near the trail, rigged old pans to strings for noise. Every little thing they could do, they did. That evening, Walter sat Dawson down by the fire. "There's something you need to know." Dawson looked up. "I used to be like him, not cruel, but angry. After we lost the baby, I shut down, thought the Lord had abandoned me, thought I'd failed as a man." "You didn't," Dawson said quietly. Walter smiled. "Neither did you." The third day dawned like any other. Birds, frost, stillness. But the stillness was too deep, too expectant. Miriam made breakfast, though no one ate much. Dawson sat near the door, Scout beside him, both staring out toward the woods. It wasn't long before they came. 6 riders this time. Crowder in the lead. He didn't stop at the gate, didn't call out. He just raised a torch and said, "Last chance." Walter stepped out, rifle in hand. "You'll have to take him." Crowder's smile turned cruel. "Gladly." And with that the first shot rang out. The crack of that first gunshot shattered the morning like glass under a boothiel. It echoed off the trees and rolled across the valley, startling birds from their roosts, and sending Scout into a growl that rumbled low in his throat. Walter ducked to the side of the porch as a second shot ripped through the air, splintering one of the support beams just inches from where he'd been standing. Miriam pulled Dawson down behind the hearth just as glass exploded inward from a window. He cried out, not from pain, but from the memory of it, the flash of belts and fists and slammed doors. Miriam pressed her palm over his chest and whispered, "Breathe, Dawson. Stay low." She didn't flinch when another bullet tore through the back wall. The rifle rested beside her, loaded and ready. Walter fired back twice, quick and steady. He wasn't aiming to hit yet, just to warn, to buy time. But he saw the riders fan out, spreading along the tree line, taking cover behind brush and rock. These weren't men who flinched. These were men who expected blood. Crowder had come prepared. Inside, Dawson scrambled for the second rifle Walter had shown him how to use just 2 days earlier. His hands shook, but he remembered every instruction. Steady your breath. Brace the barrel. Don't pull, squeeze. Miriam crawled beside him to check the windows. Most were now boarded, save for a narrow slit near the kitchen. She peered through it and caught sight of a rider crouching behind the watering trough. "West side," she called. Walter adjusted his angle and fired. The trough splintered in a burst of water and wood, and the rider dove back behind his horse. The next shot came from the ridge, punching through the roofline and dropping dust onto Dawson's hair. "We're pinned," Walter growled. "They're trying to scare us low before they move in." "Then we hold," Miriam snapped. "They want to rattle us, we won't rattle." Dawson didn't speak. He watched Miriam like she was something entirely new, like she'd dropped her apron and become forged iron. She reloaded with calm precision, eyes focused, breath steady. Scout stayed beside Dawson, tense but quiet, as though understanding the stakes. The shooting paused. 5 seconds, then 10, then longer. Silence returned, but it wasn't peace. It was the breath before the plunge. Walter moved back into the house, blood darkening the bandage under his shirt. "They're repositioning," he muttered. "They'll try to burn us out." Miriam's eyes flicked toward the oil lamp. "They'll use fire," she said, "and smoke." Then we fight fire with fire, Walter said, grabbing the bucket of ash from the hearth. We soak the outer wall, dampen the boards. Dawson fetched the water pails. Now. Dawson moved without hesitation. Outside, the wind picked up, as if sensing what was coming. Scout followed the boy to the back room, where the water barrel sat lined against the stone wall. Dawson grabbed 2 pails and returned just as Miriam was dumping a pot of dishwater across the west wall. They worked fast, efficient. Walter poured ash across the base of the cabin, layering it thick to smother embers. Miriam soaked blankets and stuffed them into the windows. Dawson refilled the pails. No one said it aloud, but they all knew it wouldn't stop a real blaze, but it might slow it, might buy them minutes. It was enough. The next attack came fast and vicious. 2 men darted from the tree line, torches in hand. One hurled his into the porch while the other charged toward the barn. Walter caught the first with a shot that dropped him mid-stride. The torch fell harmlessly into the snow, hissing out in a burst of steam. The second reached the barn, but not without consequence. Scout, loosed by Dawson without anyone noticing, tore across the yard with a fury that defied his limp. The dog sank his teeth into the man's leg, dragging him down into the snow. Walter fired once more. The man didn't get up. But the damage was done. Flames licked up the side of the barn. Smoke poured into the sky. The horses inside screamed in terror. "No," Walter hissed, lunging forward. "Walter," Miriam called, but it was too late. He ran, shoulders hunched, dodging fire and bullets. He reached the barn door and flung it open, shouting for the horses. 2 bolted past him, terrified. The third kicked at its stall door, eyes wild. Walter ducked inside, unlatched the gate, and slapped the beast hard on the flank. It charged past him, clearing the barn just as the roof began to sag. A shot rang out from the trees. Walter stumbled. He fell against the doorframe, gripping his side. Blood bloomed anew beneath his coat. "Walter!" Miriam screamed, rushing to the porch. "Stay inside," he shouted, voice hoarse. But Miriam didn't listen. She grabbed the second rifle and ran to him. Dawson stood frozen in the doorway, torn between the orders and the fear, between staying safe and watching his new family fall apart. Then he moved. He grabbed the box of cartridges and sprinted after them. The fire from the barn was rising fast now, casting long shadows across the clearing. The wind pulled the smoke toward the cabin, a curtain of ash and heat. Walter leaned heavily against Miriam as they staggered back toward the house. Scout circled them, barking and growling, eyes wide. Dawson met them halfway. "Take this," he said breathlessly, shoving the cartridges into Miriam's hands. Then he ducked beneath Walter's free arm and helped carry the weight. Inside, Walter collapsed into his chair, gasping. Miriam tore open his coat and winced at what she saw. The bullet had grazed deep, slicing through flesh near the ribs. It wasn't fatal, not yet, but it would become so without care. Dawson hovered beside her, hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I shouldn't have come. I brought this on you." Walter grabbed his hand, tight. "You brought nothing but purpose." Miriam didn't look up. Her voice was firm as she packed the wound. "We choose you, Dawson, every time." The shooting outside stopped again. Another pause, longer this time. Then came the voice. "Crowder." "Enough games," he called. "Send the boy out, or we torch the rest and shoot anyone who runs." Miriam stood slowly. She walked to the door and opened it just enough to be heard. "You burn this house and you'll answer for every nail, every board, every memory." Crowder laughed. "Lady, you think I'm scared of an old woman." "No," she said, "but you should be." Then she slammed the door. They had maybe minutes now, maybe less. Walter faded in and out, pale from blood loss. Miriam kissed his forehead and whispered something no one else could hear. Then she turned to Dawson. "Are you ready?" "I think so," he said, "but I'm scared." Good, she said. That means you know the cost, but it doesn't mean you stop. Dawson nodded. He stood beside the window, rifle in hand, Scout beside him once again. He watched the trees, the wind, the smoke, and then through the haze he saw a movement. Crowder. He was coming, this time on foot. Behind him, 4 others. They're coming, Dawson whispered. Miriam took her place at the door, rifle loaded, eyes steady. Walter, half conscious, raised a hand. Don't let them take him. We won't, Miriam said. And as the men crossed the field, faces shadowed and guns raised, Dawson thought only of his mother's voice. Soft, kind, telling him stories about angels who watched over the weak, about justice that didn't always come with a badge but sometimes came wrapped in sacrifice. He raised the rifle, breath deep, and waited. The world narrowed to 5 shadows moving through smoke, their outlines flickering with each gust of wind, like devils stepping through fire. Crowder led them, shotgun slung lazily over one shoulder, his steps slow and deliberate, like he didn't believe anyone in that cabin would dare raise a hand to stop him. But inside, every hand was steady. Dawson crouched low beside the window, shoulder pressed tight to the frame, one eye fixed on the tree line where the men were closing in. Miriam stood just behind the door, rifle in her arms, barrel angled slightly down but her breath even. Scout, limping and quiet, huddled beside Dawson, his body trembling but his eyes locked forward, protective. Walter hadn't moved since the last round of fire. He lay slumped in his chair, sweat cooling on his brow, the color leached from his face. His breath came ragged, uneven, but each one was a refusal, a stubborn clawing back of life. Miriam had pressed a folded cloth into his side, tied it tight with twine and prayer. She had kissed his temple and whispered that she'd be back, that he wasn't to go anywhere without her say-so. And now they waited. The 5 men fanned out across the clearing. Crowder stopped 10 yards from the porch and planted his boots in the dirt. You've had your chances, he called, voice low, oily, smug. This time we ain't leaving empty-handed. Miriam opened the door, not wide, just enough to see him. The rifle in her hands was no longer aimed at the dirt. I told you, she said, you'll answer for what you take. Crowder smiled, slow and condescending, and took a step forward. Behind him, one of his men, a younger fellow with a red scarf around his throat, raised his pistol and leveled it toward the window. That was a mistake. Dawson didn't even think. His finger squeezed the trigger and the recoil slammed into his shoulder like a hammer. The shot was wild, high, but it shattered the window frame, sent glass and splinters flying. Crowder's man flinched, ducked back. Boys got teeth, Crowder muttered. Dawson scrambled back from the window, heart hammering in his chest. He never fired at a man before. He wasn't sure what scared him more, that he missed or that he hadn't hesitated. Miriam didn't look back at him. She raised her rifle and took aim. Next one's real, she warned. Crowder turned his head slightly. Burn it. That was the signal. 2 of the men dropped their torches into the grass, flames licking upward as fast as dry pine would take it. The fire spread wide, curling like fingers around the perimeter of the cabin. They were trying to box them in, cut off escape, drive them out. Miriam fired. One of the torch-bearers dropped instantly, crumpling to the ground without a sound. The other fled backward, smoke wrapping around his legs. Crowder cursed, raised his shotgun and fired toward the door. The blast punched through the wood, splintering it, knocking Miriam back. Dawson screamed. She didn't fall, not all the way. She staggered, clutching her shoulder, blood blooming through the sleeve of her dress. She bit down on a cry and shoved the door closed with her good arm. Dawson dropped the rifle and rushed to her. No, please don't. I'm all right, she gasped, teeth gritted. Through the flesh, didn't hit bone. Go, get Walter, move him away from the windows. He obeyed, dragging a stool beside Walter's chair, pushing it beneath the old man's legs, trying to brace him, move him further from danger. Walter groaned but didn't wake. His skin felt too cold. Miriam leaned against the door, rifle still in one hand, though it trembled now. Her breath came shallow, quick. "They're pushing closer," Dawson whispered. "We can't stay." "We don't run," she said. "They'll burn it down, they'll kill us." Her eyes met his soft but unyielding. "Then let them learn what it costs." Another crash came, this time from the back of the house. One of the men had broken in through the pantry window. Scout barked, teeth bared, rushing toward the sound. Dawson didn't wait. He grabbed the iron poker from the hearth and ran. The man was halfway through the window when Dawson struck. The poker connected with a loud crack, catching the intruder just beneath the chin. He fell backward, his scream cut off by the impact as his head slammed into the sill. Dawson stood there, breathing hard, the poker slick in his grip. His arms trembled. Scout growled low, standing guard beside the unconscious man's body, hanging halfway out the window. Dawson turned and ran back to the main room. Miriam was still by the door, but her legs had buckled beneath her. She was sitting now, blood soaking the floorboards. "No more," Dawson whispered. "No more hurting people I love." He ran to the kitchen, grabbed the kerosene jar, and kicked open the back door. He saw the fire closing in, saw two more men flanking wide toward the rear. With a cry, he hurled the jar. It shattered just before the feet of the approaching men, splashing fire onto their legs and the dry brush behind them. They screamed, fell back. Dawson ducked behind the doorframe as bullets rang out, but the fire did its work. The line had been held for now. But the air was thick with smoke. It was getting harder to breathe. Inside, Walter stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. He coughed, choked on smoke. "Dawson, where?" "I'm here," Dawson whispered, dropping beside him. "You're okay." Walter's hand found his, gripped it tight. "You protect her, protect her." "I will, I promise." Walter's eyes closed again, not from pain this time, but from something quieter. A calm, a knowing. Miriam crawled to the hearth, propped herself up, and loaded the rifle with her one good arm. Her face was gray now, her lips pale. Still, she nodded once at Dawson. "Stay with me," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Smoke rolled in thicker now. Flames licked at the back wall. The cabin groaned under the heat. The windows cracked. Crowder's voice came again, closer this time. "Enough of this. The boy's mine. The rest of you can die in your pride." Miriam coughed, blood in the sound. "Don't listen," she rasped. "He doesn't understand love, only possession." Dawson stood. He grabbed the rifle. "No more hiding," he said. And before Miriam could stop him, he kicked open the front door. Crowder stood in the yard, smoke swirling behind him, face blackened with soot. He raised his shotgun, surprised to see the boy, just a boy, standing in the doorway. "You think you're brave?" Crowder snarled. "You ain't." Dawson stepped forward. "I'm not brave." "Then step aside." "No," Dawson said, voice steady. "You don't get to decide what I'm worth, not anymore." Crowder's eyes flicked past him to the cabin. "You think those old folks love you. They don't even know you." "They chose me," Dawson said. "That's more than you ever did." Crowder raised his gun. Dawson fired first. The bullet caught Crowder in the shoulder, spinning him to the side. He screamed, dropped the shotgun. Dawson lowered the rifle but didn't move, didn't run. Crowder fell to his knees, snarling, reaching for the weapon. But Scout leapt. The dog barreled into him, teeth flashing, fury and fire incarnate. Crowder screamed again, swatting wildly, but the dog didn't let go. Dawson ran to Scout, grabbed his collar, pulled him back. Crowder lay bleeding, barely conscious, stunned. The other men had fled. They'd seen enough. Dawson stood over the man who once called himself father. "You're not mine," he said, "and I'm not yours." Then he turned away. Behind him, the cabin still smoked but hadn't fallen. Miriam lay against the wall, the rifle across her lap. She looked up as Dawson entered, her eyes wide. "You're all right," she whispered. He knelt beside her. "So are you." And for the first time he wept. Not from fear, not from pain. From release. From love. From belonging. Walter stirred behind them, whispering something too soft to hear. Dawson leaned close. "What is it?" Walter's lips moved again, a breath, a name. "Son," he said. And then he smiled. The flames had taken the rear shed, the barn, and the last of the firewood stack, but the cabin, miraculously, still stood. Blackened at the corners, smoke curling from its seams but standing. When the smoke finally thinned and the world began to breathe again, morning light filtered down soft and strange through the mist, like God himself had swept his hand across the valley and paused a moment to see who'd made it through the storm. Walter slept like a stone, but he was alive. Miriam, her arm bound tightly in linen and soaked in her own sweat, lay propped against the hearth, her color slowly returning. Scout limped in a slow, proud circle through the cabin, checking each corner, each soul, with the solemn pace of a soldier after battle. And Dawson, the boy who was once no one's, moved like he was finally standing on legs that could carry more than just fear. He stepped outside while the air was still quiet, past the splintered doorway and down the charred steps of the porch, out into the yard that was now littered with blood and ash, and the smoldering remains of what men had done in hate. Crowder was gone. They tied him at first, hands bound, wounds dressed just enough to keep him breathing. But the man who once thundered about "what's mine" now sat hollow-eyed beneath the trees, silent and shaking. When the rest of his men fled, cowards after the first collapse of pride, he'd slumped like a punctured wineskin, all pressure gone. Walter, bleeding from 2 wounds and near collapse himself, had whispered, "We don't kill, let the law see what came here. Let them see what we stood against." And so Crowder sat under a maple tree, staring down at his empty palms like they'd failed him. Dawson approached him now, not with a weapon, not with fear, just a gaze clear and quiet. Crowder didn't even look up. "You win," he rasped. "No," Dawson said, "but I didn't lose either." Crowder chuckled weakly. "Don't fool yourself, boy. You'll grow up bitter, you'll grow up mean. It's in you." Dawson knelt so they were eye to eye. "No," he said, "that's in you, and it stops with you." Crowder's face twisted in something like confusion, or maybe grief, but no rage this time, no sneer, just a man suddenly very small in the shadow of someone stronger than him. Dawson stood and walked away. He didn't need to hear another word. The man's voice no longer meant anything. It was wind in the grass, forgotten. Inside, Miriam stirred. Walter was awake too, head resting against the edge of the rocking chair that had belonged to his grandfather, eyes open and tracing the ceiling beams. Miriam reached across the floor to take his hand. It was stiff but warm. "I thought you'd gone," she whispered. "Not yet," Walter said, voice cracked but still holding. "You stubborn, beautiful fool." He gave a weak grin. "You too." Dawson came back in then, face red from the wind, hands soot-streaked. He looked at them both, saw the way they held each other's hands, and he paused. He'd never seen that kind of love up close before. Quiet, unspoken, lasting through fire. "I'll fetch water," he said softly. "No," Miriam said, "sit." He obeyed. They didn't speak for a while, just sat in the light of a world made new by fire. Later that afternoon, the sheriff came. News had traveled faster than expected. One of Crowder's men, scared out of his skin, had ridden to town and confessed everything before sundown. Said a boy was being held, said a couple was fighting back with nothing but grit and old rifles, said Crowder was going to kill them all and take what he claimed was his. The sheriff came with 3 deputies, all armed, all grim. They expected to find a massacre. Instead, they found Miriam Wren, bandaged and burned, Walter Greaves, pale but still proud, and a boy named Dawson holding a rifle like it was part of his hand. When the sheriff saw the condition of the land, the bodies in the trees, the ruin of the barn and the broken man tied to a tree, he took off his hat and lowered his eyes. Ma'am, he said, Sir son, looks like you did what the law should have done long ago. They arrested Crowder without ceremony. He didn't fight, didn't speak, just let them drag him away like a sack of dead weight. The sheriff promised a trial, promised to send word when it came. But no one inside the cabin cared much about trials anymore. That night Dawson didn't sleep in the loft. He dragged his blanket down beside Walter's chair and Miriam's cot and curled there, scalp pressed against his back. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. In the morning, the sun rose over a blackened pasture and a battered porch, but it still rose. Walter was the first to wake. He eased himself upright, wincing as his wounds pulled, and shuffled out onto the porch. He stood there a long while, staring at the land, the smoldering remains of what had been a barn, the trampled garden rows. Then he smiled. He turned and walked back inside, found Dawson asleep in a tight little knot beside the cold hearth, found Miriam sitting up already, stirring tea with her good hand. He crouched beside the boy and laid a hand on his back. "Time to rebuild," he said. Dawson opened his eyes slowly. "I thought maybe we'd leave." Walter shook his head. "We don't run from what we've built." "But it's all burned." "Not all of it," Walter said. "Not you, not us." Miriam came over and kissed the top of Dawson's head. "You were the first thing we ever built right." The next weeks passed in the slow rhythm of survival. Dawson learned to hammer nails and split logs. He learned how to stitch torn fabric and boil liniment for healing. He learned how to carve fence posts, how to use a spade, how to measure planks with just his thumb and a squint. He grew calluses. He grew taller. He grew softer in the eyes but firmer in the chest. And Walter, still recovering, still limping, watched him with something like wonder. Miriam noticed it one day and smiled. "You're proud." Walter nodded. "I didn't know I could be," he said, "but I am." On a Sunday, months later, they rode into town. Dawson wore a clean shirt and the vest Walter used to save for weddings and funerals. Miriam had cut and sewn the sleeves to fit his thin arms. Scout trotted beside the wagon like he owned the road. When they reached the church, the preacher came down from the steps and tilted his hat. "We heard," he said. Walter didn't answer. "Folks were praying for you." Miriam stepped down first, then Dawson, eyes scanning the faces gathered on the lawn. Some stared, some whispered, but a few smiled, a few nodded. Inside, they sat together on the end of the third pew. When the hymn started, Dawson didn't sing at first, but Miriam took his hand and slowly he joined in. His voice cracked, unsure, but it was there. Later that week, a letter arrived. The trial had ended. Crowder was found guilty. He'd face the rest of his life in prison if he made it that long. There was no joy in the words, no revenge, just truth. Dawson read it, folded it, and handed it to Walter. "I don't need it," he said. And Walter burned it in the stove. The snow came again that winter, earlier than expected. But this time, the cabin was warm. Inside, the fire never went out. Bread rose on the windowsill. Tools rested clean and sharpened by the door. And Dawson, no longer the boy who'd knocked for mercy, sat carving a little wooden horse, identical to the one Miriam had given him that first week. When she asked what it was for, he smiled. "Thought we might start a shelf for the next one who knocks." She blinked, surprised. "You think there'll be another?" "There's always another," Dawson said. But now they won't have to walk through the dark alone. Outside, the wind picked up. But it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like peace. Spring came early that year, dragging warmth behind it like a blanket pulled over the land. The frost lifted off the fields with a sigh, revealing patches of green that had slept too long beneath the weight of winter. Streams ran faster, birds sang louder, and the soil softened underfoot, a promise of new things, of second chances. At the Greaves' cabin, new life stirred in every corner. Walter had built a new barn, stronger than the last, with Dawson driving every nail under his eye. The shed had been rebuilt too, and where the fire had scorched the garden patch, Miriam planted again, carrots, beans, squash. The seeds took, and for the first time in years, so did hope. Dawson changed too. His limbs stretched, his back straightened. The deep circles under his eyes began to fade, and when he laughed, which he did more often now, it wasn't a sound pulled from somewhere dark. It was full-throated, sudden, and sharp, like a spark struck from flint. He slept through the night. He ate like a boy should eat. He sang when Miriam hummed hymns in the kitchen, even though he rarely knew the words. And though his voice still cracked on high notes, he never stopped trying. Still, he carried the past like a scar under his shirt. One morning in April, Walter found him staring off toward the ridge, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. "You dreaming of running?" Walter asked, stepping up beside him. Dawson shook his head. "I was thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't knocked, if you hadn't opened the door." Walter scratched his beard and looked out at the same ridge. "I think about that too," he said. "Then I stop, 'cause life's got enough answers we never get. We don't need to chase the ones we've already lived through." Dawson nodded but didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was a kind of reverence. Like both knew they'd come out of something sacred and terrible, and now they stood side by side in its aftermath, unbroken. He glanced up. "Thank you," he said suddenly. Miriam blinked. "For what, sweetheart?" "For not giving up, for letting me stay." She reached down, brushed his hair back. "Thank you," she said, "for knocking." He smiled shy and wide. And in that moment he felt it. Not the echo of pain, not the weight of fear, but the truth of who he was now. Dawson Greaves. Son, helper, protector, loved. And as the wind rustled the trees outside, and the stars watched silently from above, he knew. This was the life that had waited for him all along. It had just needed a knock. Autumn arrived with gentler hands that year, as if even the weather had decided the little cabin had earned some peace. Leaves turned gold and copper across the valley, falling soft as whispers onto rooftops and garden beds. The breeze no longer carried dread, only the sweet scent of apples and wood smoke. Life at the Greaves homestead settled into a rhythm that felt, at long last, like living. The old scars remained. The barn still bore black streaks on its far wall, the porch steps creaked where the fire had warped the grain, and the stump in the front yard where Crowder had once stood in shackles was now overgrown with moss. But no one hurried to erase those signs. They were part of the land now, marks of what had been endured and overcome. The cabin had become more than a home, it had become a refuge. The number of residents grew with each passing month. Some came with bruises, some with silence, some with children, some alone, but all came carrying the same invisible weight, the fear that they were unlovable, unwanted, beyond rescue. And every single one found the same thing waiting behind that crooked fence and soot-kissed porch. A warm fire, a plate set with intention, and arms that never turned away. Dawson became the one to answer the door. It happened gradually. One day Miriam was too tired to stand and he said, "I've got it." Then it just kept happening. Soon, when a knock came at dusk, it was Dawson's face the broken one saw first. Taller now, steady in his stance, the rifle always resting by the doorframe, not as a threat, but a reminder that this place had been defended once and would be again. He greeted each one with the same few words. "You're safe now, come in." He didn't ask where they came from. He didn't need to. One woman, carrying a baby wrapped in a curtain and a toddler gripping her skirt, collapsed into his arms the moment she crossed the threshold. Dawson hadn't flinched. He just held her as long as she needed. When Miriam came out from the back room and asked quietly what she'd said, Dawson answered, "Nothing. Not yet." Not all stayed forever. Some only needed a season, a winter, a place to heal before moving on. But many returned years later with new stories and stronger hands, eager to help patch a roof or mend a fence. Some sent letters, others sent food. A few sent back what little money they could spare. But the door never stopped opening, and Dawson never stopped answering it. One night, as frost began to return to the earth, Walter asked to be taken up the ridge. He hadn't left the cabin grounds in nearly 2 years, not since the fever the previous fall had left him too weak to stand for long. But this time, he was insistent. So Dawson hitched the cart, bundled Walter in thick blankets, and together they rode in silence up the winding trail that once led to danger and now simply led upward. At the crest of the ridge, where you could see the whole valley stretched like a quilt below, Walter asked Dawson to stop. They sat there a long while, the old man's breath wheezing in and out like the bellows of a dying forge. "I came up here once," Walter said finally, "years before you." Dawson nodded. "Miriam told me. I came up to ask why the Lord never gave us a child, why we were left empty while men like Crowder fathered with fists and fury." Walter's hands trembled in his lap. "I yelled at the sky, said I was done waiting." "And what did he say?" Dawson asked. Walter looked at him, eyes shining now, cloudy with age but fierce with certainty. "He said to build a fence. That's all, just build a fence." Dawson smiled, blinking hard. "And you did." "A crooked one, but it held." Walter reached out, gripped Dawson's hand. "You were the answer, son. Not the punishment, the answer." That night Walter passed in his sleep. Peacefully, without pain. Miriam found him the next morning, sitting in his rocker near the fire, a blanket pulled to his chest, a smile on his face. There was no weeping, not at first. Miriam just touched his cheek, kissed his forehead and whispered, "Thank you." The funeral was quiet. Just the family, and by then, family meant many things. They buried him beneath the cottonwood tree, beside the small stone that bore no name but once marked the dream that never grew. Dawson carved a new plaque, one that joined the two into one. Walter Greaves. A good man, a strong root, a fence that held. They didn't put a date. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. In the weeks that followed, Dawson took on more. He fixed what Walter used to fix. He planted what Walter used to plant. He sat in Walter's chair, read his Bible, sharpened his tools, not because he was trying to become him, but because Walter had trusted him to carry the good things forward. Miriam aged 2. Her fingers, once nimble with thread, began to stiffen. Her steps slowed. Her naps lengthened, but her voice never weakened. And when the children, there were 5 of them now under the roof, ranging from age 2 to 10, ran to her crying or laughing or kneading, she was always ready. Her lap never closed, her hands always opened. Dawson watched her one evening as she rocked the newest baby, a girl found alone near Red Fern Creek, and he felt something in his chest he hadn't had words for until now. Love, yes. Gratitude, certainly. But also calling. All of this, was not accident. It was not coincidence. It was answered prayer made flesh. It was a once starving boy becoming the keeper of a door that never stayed shut. That night he wrote a letter. He didn't know who he was writing it to. Maybe to himself, maybe to God, maybe to the next child who might find it folded under a loose board or tucked into a hollow tree. He wrote, You are not what they said about you. You are not the bruises or the silence or the lies. You are not the thing they left behind. You are wanted. You are needed. You are home. Then he folded the letter, placed it in a jar, and buried it beneath the threshold of the porch, so that every person who ever stepped over it would be standing on something holy. Years passed. More children came, some stayed, some left and started homes of their own. Dawson married eventually, though not quickly. Love came softly, like most good things, and when it did, he knew how to hold it. Miriam passed in the spring, just after the first daffodils bloomed. She died in her sleep, same as Walter, with her hand resting on her Bible and a fresh loaf rising in the oven. She asked to be buried beside Walter. So Dawson did. He carved the stone himself, took his time, and when he was done it read, Miriam grieves. Heart of the home, giver of second chances. The house never emptied. If anything, it became fuller. More tables were added, a second cabin built, then a third. Dawson grew old, but his hands never stopped working, and when he could no longer answer the door himself, others did. Children raised under that roof answered it in his place. Always the same greeting. You're safe now, come in. And long after Dawson's voice had gone quiet, after his body had returned to the dust it once shivered on, the knock still came. And someone still answered. Because the fire never went out. And the fence, crooked though it was, still held.